Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
My name is Tamara Pesek. If you have any questions about what's upcoming for the Visiting Speaker Series or other talks that are happening at Microsoft Research this fall, please feel free to give me an email, not a call because I don't check my voicemail. Our guest today is the inimitable John Battelle, who has done amazing research on the topic of search, a topic near and dear to all of our hearts, I am sure. If you're thinking about whether or not to buy the book or thinking about whether or not the book actually talks about anything that might be interesting to you, I would suggest that you read pages 12 through 14, which is the implication section of the first chapter, which is fascinating, and it goes through a great list of questions that John talks about in the book. And basically, it's a book where there's something for everyone. John himself is an amazing journalist. He started the Industry Standard. He co-founded the Wired magazine. He founded thestandard.com, and a host of other amazing activities, I'm sure, that he doesn't bother to put in his biography. I haven't been able to drag out any dirty, horrible secrets from him to joke him about in this introduction, so I hope that you will do that for me in the Q&A section. But for right now, please help me welcome John Battelle.
Clearly you didn't Google me. I'm sorry. Microsoft, okay. The first time I came here, we got a phone call in 1993, late 93, maybe it was early 94, from Nathan Myhrvold, who at that point was running research here, I think. Is that right? Was he running research? And it was a command performance. Bill Gates, Nathan informed us, wanted the three of us, the three editorial founders of the magazine, to come up because he wasn't sure we completely understood what Microsoft was about, and wanted to show us what Microsoft was about. And I was, I was 26 and in my first big time job in journalism. I was terrified because Microsoft was and remains, such an icon. And we came up here, and there was the Whizzy Rick Rashid show, which we got taken through. You remember Tiger? You guys remember Tiger? Oh, I saw that grimace. Which was 15 years ahead of its time, and a bunch of other really cool stuff. And then Nathan Myhrvold took out his wallet, put it on the table in front of us, and said, anything in there, we're going to have a piece of it in 10 years. That was the first mistake. And I think actually it's quite interesting to see what happened after that is Passport and all that stuff was done. And then we got into the office with Bill, and he's such a legendary figure, and he indeed did rock back and forth a lot. And he sort of gave us his vision, and I don't remember really a thing he said. I was so kind of petrified that I might say something stupid that I kind of went out of there, and then we were in the cab back, and everyone's taking notes. I said, so what did we talk about in there, And I reconstituted the whole trip as a piece, and it ran on the launch as the first story on the launch of Hotwired, which was our web portal that we launched in 1994. So my story about visiting Microsoft was the first piece of journalism on Hotwired, which was, I think, one of the first, if not the first, commercial portals on the web. So there's a little bit of Microsoft lore for you. Do I pick that up? I just hung up on Bill. And Microsoft has loomed so large in my professional career, the visits up here, the continuing visits up here, and then as I became a publisher with the Standard, not just a journalist, but also a person who asks for money. I would come up here on sales calls with my very peppy salespeople, and you realize that salespeople are peppy because if they weren't, they'd probably drink themselves into a early death, because all they hear is no. And I came up here, and I didn't have a lot of experience selling things, and cracking Microsoft is the equivalent of the golden ticket to Willy Wonka's chocolate factory for a salesperson. And it took us at the Standard a year and a half to crack Microsoft, and when we did, it was a huge deal. And I'm very pleased to say the business that I'm starting after this book tour is over, Microsoft has already agreed to be a client, so it's much easier to work with Microsoft now, I must say. And so I kept coming up here, and now I'm up here with a book that has a logo that probably makes you all a little upset. I'm sure you recognize that. That's Yahoo's. No, it's Google. But when I was doing the research for this book, really, Microsoft didn't have an awful lot to say about search, because I started the book in '02. And obviously, Microsoft was a huge player in directing search traffic around, clearly, but you hadn't rolled your own yet. And so the story, as understood, was a story of the past and a story of the present. The present seemed to be increasingly about Google, which is why I chose to focus on them as a narrative actor to drive the story. But I want to say that the framing of the book, and this was very intentional on my part, and you can see this was a compromise, because my publisher said, I want to call it The Search, because this big idea is, what does it mean to search, and what is it going, and what's the implications culturally, and all that stuff. And they said, well, can you just call it The Google, and Google, colon, Google. Because they're in New York, and in New York, there's only one thing on the internet, which is Google. And Google was hot, and Google was going to have an IPO soon, and everyone was talking about Google. So this was the compromise, to use the font from Google and put Google in the subtitle. And in fact, Google does occupy 5 or 6 chapters of the book, which is about half the book. But the other half talks about the framing of why I think search is such a big deal. I'm going to read a couple of things from the book, if you'll indulge me, that talk about that. And really my first the sort of aha moment for me on writing this book was right after September 11th, which for me was a terrible day for everybody, and sort of doubly terrible for me because that was also the week that the Standard went out of business. And the Standard was a rocket ship. It did extremely well, and then it went down as quickly as it went up. If not, actually faster. Actually, I think it went faster down than it did go up. It lost 75% of its revenues in 3 months, and the revenues were $150 million. So when you lose that much of your revenue base in 3 months, it's really hard to stay in business because your cost structure, unless you have margins like Office or something. But we didn't have margins like that. We had like 20, 30% margins, so we all of a sudden had an overhang of $40 or $60 million of liability that we couldn't cover, and went out of business. And it was at that moment, wandering around, I mean, how many of you were here in sort of late 2001? A lot of you. Was it happy? No, right? It was just not a happy time to be anywhere in the technology industry, and it was not happy for me. I had lost faith, really, in a story that I had covered since 1986, 1987. I had covered technology. I started covering the Macintosh and Apple, and went on to cover LANs and WANs and networking and stuff like that, and then helped start Wired, and then the Standard, and then it blew up, and I looked around and said, there's no story here anymore. There's nothing interesting. The entire story is either the people in New York going, yeah, 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 I told you so, which is basically just a bunch of sour grapes over the AOL Time Warner merger, in my opinion, and or kind of the retrenchment, and it's all about enterprise, remember that, or it's all we got to find a market here somewhere, but it was not very interesting. And one day, someone sent me a link to Google Zeitgeist. How many of you have seen Google Zeitgeist? Go, that's the most at any audience I've ever asked, including Google. That's true. There's 200 people at Google, and they're like, Google Zeitgeist? That's because they all joined yesterday. So Zeitgeist is a very interesting tool, and I'm going to read you a short passage of kind of my discovery of it, and that's how this book sort of came to be. Let's see. So Zeitgeist is a clever public relations tool, and Lord knows Google is good at that summarizes search terms that are gaining or losing momentum during a particular period of time. By watching and counting popular search terms, Zeitgeist provides a fascinating summary of what our culture is looking for or finds interesting, and conversely, what was once popular that is losing cultural momentum. Since 2001, Google has maintained a weekly Zeitgeist, but the link I found was the company's first ever version of the tool, and it summarized the entire year, and what a year 2001 was. Listed among the top gaining queries were Nostradamus, #1, CNN, #2, and of course that was a navigational search, because people were going to CNN, they couldn't get to it because it was overloaded, and they thought somehow Google would magically take them there. What they got was a 404, but that's the start of Google News. Actually, Google noticed that, and they started to cache CNN, and that became Google News. World Trade Center was #3, Anthrax was #5, and the only term to break into the top 5 that was not related to the terrorist attacks, a collective fantasy about magic and children, Harry Potter, at #4. The fastest declining queries, Pokemon, #1, followed by Napster, Big Brother, and that was the reality television show, not any other implication of Big Brother, X-Men, and the woman who won Who Wants to Marry a Multimillionaire. I was transfixed. Zeitgeist revealed to me that Google had more than its finger on the pulse of our culture. It was directly jacked into the culture's nervous system. This was my first glimpse into what I came to call the database of intentions, a living artifact of immense power. My God, I thought, Google knows what our culture wants. And for me, that was December of '01. That was my aha moment. And it wasn't Google. It was this idea behind it, which was that there were millions and millions of people pouring their desires into this little box, and that was recordable. Not that it was necessarily being recorded, but that it could be, that the possibility existed for that. And I started calling people and asking whether or not they recorded it, and many of them said, are you kidding? You know, hard drives are too expensive and processing power is too dear, and we can't possibly do that. But everyone's doing it now because of what has happened with both those things. And of course, that's how we learn and create better search algorithms, pay attention to this stuff. But when you take together all the search queries across all the potential sites across the internet, and all of it discoverable, all of it trackable, all of it archivable, all of it capable of being subpoenaed, for example, it seems to me that we're creating a really interesting new artifact that our culture is only just beginning to think about in terms of what it means. And for me, that was the book. That was the story. That was why all of a sudden I decided that maybe there was something worth paying attention to in this industry again. And that began the journey for me of writing the book. The first step was to send Eric Schmidt, who had just gotten the CEO job at Google, an email and ask him if he would sit down and talk to me about this idea. And he sort of humored me and said, sure. I knew him from his days at Novell. And so we sat down and had this whole debate, and in which I said, do you have any idea what you're onto? And he said, yeah, a little. And I said, you've got this massive pile of information about what people want. And you know, I'm a publisher, or at least I used to be, and you know, one of the things we do in the media business is try to figure out what people want, and then we create content to give it to them. And you have the whole media business in your hand, and that's just one thing you could do. And he said, media is not very interesting. And I said, okay, well, that's my whole career, so we'll set that one aside for a second. What are you interested in doing with this? And he said, well, we're a technology company, and we want, you know, what's the next big technology thing that we can do? We've done search. You know, what's the next big thing we could do? And I said, I pass. I don't know. It's not my job. But I came back a year later when I had decided to do the book, to interview him for the book specifically. So this would have been early '03. And one of his first things he said to me is, isn't the media business great? What he had realized, of course, is that, you know, once you know what the world wants, you can give it to them through an infrastructure like AdWords, which had just started when I spoke to him the first time, and which had grown by hundreds of millions of dollars in 1 year. And all of a sudden, that was a very interesting business. And clearly, it's a very interesting business for more than Google. And I very much look forward to seeing how Ad Center is going to do, by the way. Anyone here from the Ad Center group? See me afterwards. Kind of moving along from that, there is a story that I like to tell whenever I speak to people, because I want to sort of impress upon anyone who wants to listen that search is a really is a story that had a long history prior to Google, certainly, and prior to the history we're all sort of about to write in the next stage, which I think is it's just about to get interesting. And there's a fellow who's part of that history who I think deserves a lot of credit who didn't really get it, and his name is Bill Gross. How many of you know who Bill Gross is? Great. So for you, this may be a little bit of repetition, but I'm just going to read the first 3 or 4 paragraphs of a chapter I wrote about Bill Gross. What he did was he didn't invent the idea of pay-per-click advertising and the auction model, but he perfected it, and it became a business model that was obviously extremely powerful and pretty much dragged the internet out of its funk from 2001 through 2003 and provided that sort of cardiopulmonary system which has now spawned a huge wave of innovation in terms of new companies where their business model is basically, let's get a site up, let's provide a free service. Once we start getting traffic, if we have an innovative service people like, we'll plug in AdSense, and we'll use that until we figure something else out, right? And that's the business model. And it actually seems to be working in many cases. Bill Gross doesn't get the credit for that, but I think he really should. So I spent a lot of time with him and with Gary Flake, who's now here at Microsoft, who became the chief engineer over there at Overture, which GoTo became Overture. And kind of tried to really soak in his story until I felt like I could tell it. So I wrote this chapter kind of in a voice that I think reflects the manic sort of energy of this fellow Bill, who I have a lot of respect for. This is the beginning of the chapter. It's called $1 Billion One Nickel at a Time. Had he just stuck to his guns, he'd be the one hailed as the revolutionary. No, the one on the cover of every business magazine. No, the cover of Time magazine, with a guest chair on Charlie Rose to boot. Bill Gross, founder of the company with the most anticipated IPO in the history of Wall Street, the mad genius who rewrote the rules of business and rewired the way our culture understood itself. Indeed, had Bill Gross not given up his argument, had he just followed his gut, there might not even be a Google. Brin and Page might have sold out to Yahoo or Excite or Microsoft, or merged with Ask Jeeves, or gone the way of AltaVista, sinking slowly into the dark oceans of corporate M&A. Imagine that. A world with no Google. A world where Brin and Page, those arrogant little upstarts, are no more than forgotten footnotes in a much grander story. The story of a serial entrepreneur with a modeled past who finally proved himself beyond all possible doubt. Indeed, had this version of history come to pass, this very book would be talking about how GoTo transformed our culture. Only, it's not. Bill Gross has not created tens of billions of dollars in market value, at least not yet, and the trail of lawsuits and querulous press clippings littering his past are proof that he failed in his quest to get each and every one of his investors F-U rich. But while Bill Gross can quite legitimately claim to have created the business model that made Google possible, in the process reinventing pretty much the entire economic cardiopulmonary system of the internet. And at the end of the day, that's certainly something. So then I go in for the rest of the chapter to tell this guy's story. I mean, he couldn't be more different than Larry and Sergey or Bill and Paul, for that matter. I mean, a guy who absolutely has to make businesses or his head will explode. I mean, he just has to, and he started when he was 12, arbitraging candy at school, which paid for his books that he learned how to make solar kits, which he sold in the back of Popular Mechanics, which got him into Caltech, where he started a stereo company, the profits from which he used to start a company that skinned Lotus 123 with natural language, which got him bought by Mitch Kapor, which got, and on and on and on, till Idea Lab, and then GoTo, nay Overture, nay Yahoo. And so it's a great story, and that's just one of many stories that's in here. I tell the story of Louis Monnier of AltaVista, who's now at Google via eBay, and a bunch of others. So I kind of tried to tell stories, because if I were to do it as well, here's search's impact on A, B, C, D, E, and F, you'd all fall asleep, and I would have really not had a good time writing it. As it is, I had a really good time writing it because I started a blog at the same time. Any of you read Search blog? Yay. And that became really where I found my voice and how I learned to write to an audience that was sophisticated, because that audience would keep me very, very honest. And that was a very important part of the authorship of the book, which was to have a conversation with a group of people while you were writing, which is very contrary to the idea of how an author is supposedly supposed to work in this culture, which is that you lock yourself into a room until you come out sort of staggering and bleeding with a manuscript. I found that anytime I got stuck, I just asked myself, what was I trying to say? And then I'd kind of write a post about it, and I'd stick it up there, and then people would react and say, well, you missed this, or this completely, is in the wrong direction, or this is great, but, and then it helped me work the book to its sort of final conclusion. But I think I'd love to do Q&A and a lot of it if we could, and I'm anticipating some of the questions already, but I'd like to maybe end with with perhaps what might be anticipating the first question, which is, what about Google? And do that by reading a little bit here in the book where I spoke to a bunch of people and kind of came up with my best case analysis of what Google might be doing. And this, remember, was written in February. And what is it now? October. So, a very long time ago by the standards of our industry. But I felt a need to at least try to summarize some of the potential of Google. And when I did, there was really only one company that I could find as an allegory, and that was Microsoft. So if the comparisons now in the press are my fault, I'm very sorry. But I don't think so. I think it was an obvious conclusion to draw. So I'm going to read that section to you with a couple of paragraphs out, because I don't want to read for too long here. It starts with this idea of me. I sat down with Eric and I said, so what's next? And he kind of did one of those classically Google flip answers, which was like carbon nanotubes to the moon or something, And you're like, come on, man, you're running a business. You got to answer this question, where are you going? What's the next thing that you're interested in? And he was kind of very fussy about that and didn't want to go very, very deeply into it, which is understandable. A journalist is trying to prod your strategy out of you. You're not going to get much out of anybody. But he did give me the scenario of AdWords everywhere and how AdWords is going to become an auction-based, marketplace between buyer and seller on every level, potentially across the entire global GDP, right? Anything for sale, anything that might be purchased, right? Which seems like an awfully big thing to aspire to, but it didn't seem big enough. So I'll start. That's the lead into where we start here. So Google is angling to become the de facto marketplace for all of global commerce, unseating eBay in the process. Okay, that's big, but is it big enough to fulfill the world's expectation for this company? When grasping for precedents that might explain Google's future, only one will suffice: Microsoft. Over the course of 3 decades, Microsoft became one of the most valuable companies in the world by relentlessly focusing on its core mission of a computer on every desk and Microsoft products running on every computer. Audacious as this goal was when stated by founder Bill Gates, Microsoft pretty much achieved it, in the developed world anyway, within 20 years. Now let's parse Google's audacious goal: to organize the world's information and make it accessible. Note that the word search is not in the mission. Search is, in the end, the presumption, one side of an equation that presumes something needs to be found. And how might anything, recall Schmidt's words previously spoken to me, Google wants to help you find anything, be found? The answer is simple. Forget about a computer on every desk. Instead, the entire world needs to be computerized. And to many observers of Google's strategy, that's exactly what the company is out to take advantage of. Let's break down Google's mission even further. What is information, anyway? In the end, it's data that describes something, anything. Maybe it's a document on the web, but to think that's where it ends is to think small. Perhaps it's the location of your GPS-enabled keys, or the cost of a box of Pampers on a store shelf in suburban Miami. It could be your wedding photos, or a real-time video stream of a tsunami racing across the Indian Ocean. If the first few years of Google's rise to dominance have taught us anything, it is this: if something is of value, it needs to be in Google's index. What happens if the entire world becomes the index? This is where the concept of, and no hissing yet, a web operating system comes in. Recall, there's a little giggles anyway. Recall Microsoft's success in driving a computer to every desk with Windows on every computer. The next step in the evolution of the computer was clearly the connection of every computer to every other, what came to be known as the Internet. But what's next after that? According to many, the web is in the process of becoming the next great computing platform, the successor to Microsoft Windows, owned by no one but used by everyone. And the web is also in the process of connecting to everything, be it a desktop computer, a mobile phone, an automobile, or a set of keys. Given that, the theory goes, the companies best positioned to deliver hugely scaled services over the web platform are best positioned to win. And when it comes to hugely scaled services, nothing beats search. Google's mission of organizing the world's information and making it accessible sets the company up to deliver nothing short of every possible service that might live on top of a computing platform, from mundane applications like word processor and spreadsheets, Microsoft's current bread and butter, to more futuristic services like video on demand, personal media storage, distance learning. Many experts believe that in the near future we'll store just about everything that can be digitized on one massive platform, the Google Grid. In other words, Google has, in its 7 short years of corporate life, become a canvas upon which we project every application or service that we can imagine might arise in our increasingly digital future. Google as phone company, as cable provider, as university, as eBay, Amazon, Microsoft, Expedia, and Yahoo rolled into one. It's conceivable, and that, in the end, is what makes the company, and search, the application that spawned it, so fascinating. Nothing beguiles like the promise of unlimited potential. For now, anyway, Google holds that promise. So I wanted to read that because that's sort of some rhapsodizing about Google, so to speak, in the book. But it also reflects 300 or 400 interviews with a lot of different people. And I think all of you have perhaps felt that rhapsody and probably wonder whether or not it's real. And I wonder, and that's why I want to start a conversation now with you about how you feel about that. Because that was exactly the rhapsody I felt when I first came to Microsoft in 1992. That anything was possible here, that when Nathan Myhrvold took out his wallet and put it on the desk, there was no question that that was going to happen. And when Rick Rashid showed me Tiger, I was convinced that the entire cable company infrastructure was going to fold into Microsoft. So we've seen this movie before, the movie that's playing out right now with Google. All of you have seen it before and maybe have lived it here and continue to live it. And I'm just very honored by the chance to come and speak to you and hopefully get into a conversation. So thank you very much for listening to me, and now I hope to listen to you. Question?
How would things be different if Microsoft was located in the Valley?
Well, parts of Microsoft are now, which I think has made a difference.
Heart and soul was there.
Heart and soul. I'll tell you one thing, it probably would have been a lot more difficult for what happened in the late 90s to happen. You know, I think in the late 90s, Microsoft took it in the stomach, you know, some sucker punches as well as some fair punches in the stomach. And you had a Valley versus Redmond thing happening that was very, very strong. You know, you had the coterie of Dorr and McNeely and you know, Kleiner Perkins and Andreessen and a whole group of people in the 97, 98, 99 time frame that were really actively, you know, working against Microsoft. I think that's harder to do if your kids go to school together. Really, I think there's something to be said for that. And detente is probably easier to reach if that's also the case. So I think that piece of it would be number one. Number two is the Valley is such an odd ecosystem. I mean, I live in Marin, which is the furthest north you can still be in the Bay Area and make it to the Valley in an hour and a half or so. And there's a reason for that. As a matter of fact, in 1988, the owner of the magazine that I was working at the time tried to move us all down to the Valley, and we all went on strike because we wanted to stay in San Francisco and be a little bit apart from that incredibly incestuous and powerful culture of the Valley. So if you were part of it, if Microsoft was in the Valley, you would have, I think, created, by dint of your sheer size, an entirely different culture, I think. You know, how many people are up here?
30,000.
30,000, okay, which is probably about, I'm going to guess, 20% of the size of the sort of metastructure of the valley, which is a couple 100,000 or maybe 10%. So it would have been a very significant, Mark and many others talk about the cliques of people who kind of work through valley cultures. At Google now there's the Netscape folks and the Sun folks and the people who used to work at, other valley companies. Can you imagine if that kind of circulation occurred with Microsoft on a more regular basis, and it wasn't kind of the carping that happens now on the flights between Seattle and San Francisco? There's clearly people who go between the valley and here all the time, but you can imagine how much more robust it would be, and the friendships that develop that would probably allow for more collegial atmospheres. So I'm not sure what would happen, but I think anthropologically it would have been much more robust.
So regarding Google culture and information, thinking about the press stuff and the library stuff and all that, where do you think the balance lies between an altruistic providing great search for information that's out there and potentially acquiring information for other uses? I'm thinking like, say, Google Wi-Fi, for example.
In terms of acquiring information about users and so on. This is the great open question of Google, in my opinion. When you look at the pressures of a business, of a public business, in terms of where are there opportunities to make lots more money, and or once the money is not as easily made as it is now, where can you either protect or increase margin? One of the places is knowing more about users and taking that information and doing things with it that may or may not be permission-based, or maybe permission-based but aren't awareness-based, right? That is, I think, the greatest potential beyond just blowing up because of internal issues for stumbling that I see Google having. One of the executives told me off the record, it's in the book, off the record, in other words, don't use my name. We're one bad story away from being Big Brother. And I think that's true. It has to be a particularly bad story because we saw the Gmail story, right? And people got over that pretty quick. It has to be something like, there's a research group at Google that has been tracking, a bunch of people across America who have a profile that maybe is not so savory, and they've been doing things with that data that are really bad. I don't know, selling it to other people or serving them a different set of search results and changing the way they use the web, whatever. Something really bad has to happen. There is a story in the book about something like this that has been alleged in a lawsuit, which I report on in the American Blinds case. Look at Chapter 9, I think it is. But I think it has to be something like that. And Google is so aware of this vulnerability, I doubt they would do something as dumb as that. But the fact is, it's not 30 or 300 people anymore. It's 3,000, 5,000, 10,000 people. You can't control what everybody does, no matter how strong your culture. And so I think that the potential for slipping up on that axis is great.
Things about where FNP is going. And
You mean my company?
and what is needed in a world where we already have AdWords. And all the
Right, we already have AdWords. Why would we ever need any other kind of...
Yes.
We don't need anything else.
What are the benefits?
He asked, where is FMP going? And I'll be brief because I don't want to, but Federated Media Publishing is my next business, and it's backed by Pierre Omidyar and the New York Times. And they just figured, you did so well with the Standard. We can the big difference between Federated, there's a bunch of differences, but the big difference is that I needed about $40 million to get the Standard to where it eventually ended up as a profitable company before it blew up. And I need less than $1 million to do what I'm doing now. And that is the difference between starting a business in this time and starting a business, in Web 1.0, so to speak. Federated Media is simply a mashup of a couple of business models. One of them is the record industry model. I'm not getting into music, but rather the business of making musicians successful. I'm going to be in the business of making authors successful, and by authors I mean blog authors or any author on the web. And William Morris, which is also in the business of making authors or talent successful. And then the other piece of my business is an ad network business, which is putting the labors of the authors, the author's work, connecting that with marketers. And so what I'm doing is aggregating high-quality sites like Boing Boing, Metafilter, Waxy, O'Malley, SearchBlog, which is my site, and a bunch of others, into a federation where all the intellectual property is owned by them, but I aggregate them and turn them towards marketers and make a match. And that match is based on a conversation, and that's what I think is missing in AdSense and a lot of other things, although AdCenter, of course, is striped by demographics, which I think is really important. Still in all, the author should be the one who chooses what's on their site. It shouldn't be chosen by an algorithm. And so I'm staying up the stack, so to speak, and I'm not scaling to millions of sites. I'm starting with 20. And it turns out those 20 sites in aggregate have 6 million monthly uniques and about 50 million page views. And if you do that, start with a technology cluster, and you can go to health and beauty and travel and sports and politics, and you can see how 2020, all of a sudden you have a very large site. But it's all high-end stuff in terms of really high quality, great conversations. The premise is that blogs are different. Not really hugely, massively, let's change the world different, but there's a different kind of thing going on. It's more like a musician and an audience, where there's a conversation like this going on, as opposed to a dictation. And I think I've been in the dictation media business, and I've been doing blogging now for a long time, and I'm the band manager for Boing Boing, and I just love that conversation, and I want to see if people can independently do that full time without having to sell themselves to AOL. So, not that that was an indication of my view on anything.
To what extent do you see, and in what ways do you see Google over leveraging their brand through line extension, therefore diluting their power, the power of their brand?
Google is much like the universe, expanding in all directions at once, right? Which was actually, if you remember the pre-IPO buzz about Google, it was they're a one-trick pony. In early '04, that was kind of the response, right? Well, they only got one, they got AdWords. I asked Sergey Brin on stage, or actually was it, yeah, I think it was Sergey, last week, maybe it was Omid Kordestani, about their spaghetti against the wall approach to business, which is frustrating to people who want to partner with them because they don't know how to partner with them because they're not sure what the business model is. And he said it was a virtue, and that, essentially this idea, which I'm curious what you guys think of, here we are in the research building, right? So of kind of incorporating a little piece of research building into every single employee and giving them 20% time and saying, you guys go dream it up, and if it's good enough, we'll put wood behind the arrow and send it out into the world and pat it on the butt and say, good job. He said, this is a new approach to innovation, and we're really behind it. We think it really works. And I said, but, Wall Street likes a plan. They like to know, like, okay, what's your next, I just read Directions on Microsoft, the publication, which I think is very open of you to have that publication in your lobbies. Like, I think that's great. It is independent, isn't it? Yeah, that's what I thought. But, so that's, I don't think you'd see Directions on Google and the Google log, not that there is any such publication, though I thought maybe I should start one. Yeah, so there'd probably be a couple readers. I was reading in there, and, I was saying, well, here's, what the executives are saying, that the 7, major pushes in the business lines for the next year, and here's the predicted growth for those pushes. You would never hear that at Google, right, ever. I find it a little disingenuous, because if you look at the products that have actually bubbled up to some significant scale, and I don't know what significance, like, they are scaled, but you don't know how much. They are to a T the ones you would expect them to do if they had a strategic planning strategy process, right? Mail, right? I am, these are the kinds of things that you would do to increase page view turn, toolbar, desk bar, sidebar, to increase user registration, to all the things that you need to do if you're going to start competing with MSN, if you're going to start competing with AOL, with Yahoo on their unique differentiation, which is that they have registered users who have given permission to know more about them. They are doing that. And to sort of say, well, it was a 20% time thing that we sort of thought was neat, that sounds disingenuous to me. I think it's far more planned than they let on. That's just my gut. that is not sourced. That's my gut. So.
I bet you've been thinking about this. As search gets better and better, what are the social consequences that we haven't imagined yet?
Oh, man. As search gets better and better, what are the social consequences? One of the things is you find more people, I think, actually. You find people and communities that share your passions or your goals or your weird quirks. And I mean, I did. I got interested in search, and all of a sudden I found a community of hundreds, if not thousands, of people I didn't know existed, and I found them through search, which is sort of recursive and self-referential, but true. The other thing I think that our culture is not quite there yet in understanding is that you will get this feeding back in that happens once, like you put your name into the index, and you don't like what you see. The next thing is like, how do I change that, right? And if you're a company, you do that, and if you're a person, you do that, which means that you start to build things that will be indexed, right? And so you start to create a conversation around yourself or the things that you care about in order to try to change what the index is saying about who you are, or who that thing is that you care about. That's interesting too, is that it is changing that idea. The social search idea, which is search those things that your friends search, or the tagging and the delicious idea and all that kind of stuff. I am a classic semi-slow follower when it comes to this stuff. Like, I will go stare at it and call Josh Schachter and go, what is this all about? Explain it to me so I understand it intellectually. But until I get it emotionally, I don't get it, and I don't get it yet. That doesn't mean it's not important. I actually write in the book that I think it's probably going to be very important in terms of changing search. They can watch these patterns in the click stream and start to build algorithms on that feed back into the query answer loop that provide better searching based on the trails left by others, which is the original Vannevar Bush kind of Memex idea, right? I just still don't see why I want to tag things yet. I'm not there yet, and I'm a blogger, and I'm pretty deep in this culture, but I'm still like, I just can't get up for tagging stuff. And I'm waiting for the reason that's going to make me want to do it, because I sense that that's the same thing as I was waiting for the reason to get on AOL, because I got on AOL about the same time about 5 million other people did, and they went like this, And so I see myself as the ultimate test case. If I can do it, then my mom can do it, and then it'll get done. But I don't see it quite yet. Is tagging a big part of MSN? It's not really part of MSN search yet, is it? No, I don't think it is. Google just announced support for it. Well, didn't announce, actually. They rolled it out and didn't tell anyone. But we noticed. And so we'll see. But.
Sort of a follow-up to tagging as an idea. Are we, as an internet culture, hobbling ourselves with we've got a pair of active metaphors for navigation. We've got just straight-out search, and then we've got this traditional linking friend of a friend thing. Not that old-style portals would work anymore or were ever a good idea, but are we looking hard enough for a new way to navigate information?
No. I think, Sue and I were talking about this before, I think that the most interesting work in search has to do with user experience and user interaction, user interface. Because Gary Flake, when we met a lot, Gary and I, 3 or 4 times, and I didn't understand half the things he was saying, which is why we had to meet a lot. Because it's like, okay, wait, you just said this, and I need you to explain it in English. But one of the things he said was, I very much wish for just one more modal dialogue, which is, you're going to give me 2 words or 3 words, and then I'm supposed to figure out what the answer is for you in context perfectly. It's really hard to do that, right? If I could just ask you one more question. If you could hang out for one more question. And at Yahoo, when he tried to make the case for this to be done, they would run the user testing and say, well, we're going to lose half the people when we do that. People are just saying, I don't have time to give you another, I'm going to go to Google where they don't ask me, right? And so it was too terrifying to possibly drive people away from your engine and put this next level of interface up so that you could start to refine your search. But that's really a UI issue. Is there a way to make the UI, resolve itself around that query so that the query becomes a journey, right? That at the end of the day, it becomes a conversation, which I think is a great word for it. And I think the answer to that is yes, but the technology behind it is deeply hard. That's what we were talking about earlier. And because it's so hard, it's going to come slowly. And we've already seen it. I mean, right? We have clustering, we have all these sort of things, but they haven't quite taken off yet because they're not quite there. But there's so much evolving now. I know that kind of AJAX is a buzzy word, but I have to say that the interface stuff that's made possible by this combo thin, rich client thing that's going on now is really allowing some stuff to happen that couldn't happen before, and some UI stuff to happen that may give us point towards some answers. First time I ever saw a search-driven AJAX user interface was on A9, on Udi Manber's first version of his engine, and it was like, and then I realized that I was sort of a search geek, and I was going to do the stuff that he had programmed basically for people like me, and that I was 2% of the world. So we have a long way to go on that particular front. Yeah, I think that the user interface is the biggest challenge. The second biggest is that the web is growing like faster than we can count, and that everything is getting put into the index. And by the way, the stuff that's getting stuck in the index now does not conform to traditional algorithms of ranking and relevance, right? So you've got, video. I don't know. How do you rank video? Blockbuster 100 lists. I mean, how do you rank that? How do you rank structured databases? With no links in them, so you don't have any link rank. It's very difficult problems. And then how do you mix them all together and get one big ranking for all of it? I'm glad you guys are working on that. It's hard stuff.
So a culture question, especially to a blogger. We've moved from a world where we had a shared experience of different views. You see the news, there'd be different viewpoints.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There are different viewpoints. We've moved to, basically an echo chamber where everybody, has their own viewpoint. No matter what the commentators are, they're really basically just referring back and forth to their friends. And we have a very homogeneous set of discrete views across the web. How do you think that's going to affect our culture long term?
I'm not sure I buy the premise. I understand it, and I think there are certainly any number of folks who are bouncing around their own echo chambers. But I always thought that the people who move the culture forward are always the ones that get out of those chambers and kind of, zip amongst them. And those tend to become the people who are leaders and authorities and have the voices that draw audiences and therefore become kind of iconic conversationalists in our culture, I hope. And the web is a place where that kind of stuff can thrive. And so, I, for example, in my work, read the feeds of a ton of different people who all disagree with each other and find that really useful. Robert Scoble called me while I was on a radio show on Sunday, for example, and I read his feed quite religiously, and I read Google's, and I read Yahoo's, I read all sort of in that world. A lot of disagreement there, subtle, but quite rancorous if you get into it. But I think that there's always going to be centers of gravity, and I think there will be a place for authoritative sourcing. I have no concerns about the future of the New York Times or the Washington Post as sort of touch points. And this is from a professor of journalism who says newspapers are basically dead. I think in paper, it's a very difficult prospect over 10, 20, 30, 50 years. But as informational sources with authority, I think they will only become more valuable. And I think we, as a culture, need to teach only one thing to our children, which is critical thinking. And if we do that well, then we're going to be great, because there'll be plenty to think about and plenty of knowledge to access to think about. And I don't think we necessarily do a very good job of that with a testing-driven school culture, but don't get me started with that. It's probably another book,
If Google keeps growing and fulfills some of the potential that you've described for it, it seems kind of inevitable that it would encounter some of the same legal challenges that Microsoft's encountered at some point. You've already referred to governments being concerned about privacy invasion. It seems inevitable. Did you see anything in your experience with Google in their corporate image or their corporate culture or their business strategies that would help them to address those kinds of legal constraints on growth in any way different than how Microsoft's?
Well, one major difference, I think is a really important one, is that there weren't 4 robust competitors to Windows. And that's a big, 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 big difference. That, if Google does something like the earlier question that is considered evil with my data, I'll just start using Microsoft or Yahoo or Ask or whoever else. And it's so easy for me to switch. But if I read in the paper that Microsoft's being sued by the DOJ, it's not very easy for me to switch to a Mac, or it's not very easy for me to switch to Linux or something like that. It's just very difficult and expensive and time-consuming to do that. And I think that fact alone sort of keeps Google honest, at least for now. The culture, that's a good question. I didn't get the sense the culture's thought too hard about this. And my issue with Google goes back to this idea of the database of intentions. You've got all this information. Now, you may not have any desire to use it in a malodorous way, but have you read the Patriot Act? And there are government authorities who might have all sorts of reasons for using information about me in my search history. What I found a little bit stunning is that Sergey Brin had not read the Patriot Act, nor did he know the implications of it. And for someone who is in the position that he was in, I just found that kind of stunning. Because that act is, well, I think it's bad law, and other people think it's great law, but it's an important law either way you feel about it, right? And it does give a broad authority to, so I explained it to him, and I said, well, basically what it says is that the government can come and demand all the records it wants to demand, and you have to give it to them. And you are under law required to not tell me if you do it, right? The government will determine when it wants to inform me of this search on my records in their good time, and it's not defined by the law when that good time is. So that's kind of a little bit scary if you've looked at the history of government, which is not so good in this area. And Sergey said, that's interesting. Well, if that ever were to happen, I'm sure that we could change our policies and maybe we would take a stand on this, but it's never happened. And I said, well, Sergey, you can't tell me whether or not it's happened. You break the law if you tell me whether it's happened. And he kind of looked at me and he thought for a while and he realized he kind of got called out on that one. Of course, I put it in the book because it was too rich not to. But that's the thing, right, is that now, that doesn't mean that David Drummond, the legal counsel there, hasn't thought about it. I'm sure he has. I did ask him, but didn't get a response in time for publication. But I don't know. I just get the sense that at Microsoft you'd get an answer that was an answer. Yeah, we've thought about this. We're counsels on this. Here's our position on this. It's a mature company that has to deal with this stuff, right? And same for even Yahoo. But I just think that the company is still, its hair is still on fire. It's still running 1 million miles a second. And it's entering an arena where there are established players that have been there a long time, and it hasn't had institutionally or culturally the time to consider the implications of what it is. And I think it's just going through that right now, which is why I believe that in the next 3 to 5 years there's going to be a moment, much like the moment that AOL went through when it had its crisis, not the one with Time Warner, but the one, that was another moment, but the America on Hold crisis moment, or the Microsoft DOJ crisis moment, or the Yahoo lays off massive numbers of workers crisis moment, right? I very much hope Google has that moment because it means it'll be around a long time, If it doesn't, it might explode spectacularly, I've been through that. That's hard to come back from. So
I'd like to home in on mission, organize.
Yeah, an important word.
Yeah, which is one we kind of homed in on. When I say we, I mean in sort of executive responses to what Google means to Microsoft. And of course the response has been, well, we don't seek to organize. We seek to allow you to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether that means we're taking that word in the wrong way and it's kind of building our straw man to suit ourselves, or whether that really represents a challenge for Google in that they really are seeking to organize, and then that therefore means something that actually counter what what people really want to do for themselves.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about Microsoft's role in terms of that as being letting you organize, but if you look at the application side, I think that's certainly true. If you look at the web services piece of that, I think that from the web services piece, there is a certain structuring of information that needs to be done in order to make it useful to people. And I think if you look at Google Print and Google Video, these are organizing the information so that it becomes accessible and useful, right? Google, I make probably too long comparison between Google and Yahoo in the book. And one of the things that I noticed was staring at the companies, which is increasingly true, is how allergic Google is to making media, which if you think about the word organize, I organize the news and turn it into media, and that's what I do. But they are very allergic to making media. They don't want content that they make on their site. Now, Yahoo is not allergic to that at all, right? And that separates the two companies from the very beginning, when Yahoo was an edited directory organized by humans, and Google was an algorithm, right? And Microsoft, I think, has been a little bipolar on this issue about, are we media, are we not media? And there's been a huge investment, then a pullback, and then another huge investment, then a pullback. It's a very difficult question, because it means you're in a different kind of business. In the news business? Are you in the entertainment business? I think Google has very much declared that they are not, that they are in the access to news, access to information business. And I think that's, everybody I've talked to there has made that distinction. But I would guess they could change their mind, and they may.
So, speaking of media, so since I'm sure you're meeting with a lot of interesting people in the Valley, what's the reaction you're getting from a lot of people as far as a lot of the RAA and the MPAA exerting more and more influence on kind of Silicon Valley and us, and where do you see that going? And do you see maybe Google or MSN or whoever kind of being able to kind of break some of that up and do no evil?
Yeah. How many of you here were here for Cory Doctorow's talk? Did you guys come to that? Yeah. Cory is a blogger at Boing Boing and a pal of mine. I generally share his views on this, although I'm not as emotional about it. But I just do not understand it, and I've spent a lot of time with these guys in Hollywood too. Why they're suing their customers? I do not understand why they're doing what they're doing. And if you ask Mark Cuban, he'll say it's because studio chiefs have really good jobs and they don't want to lose them in the next 10 years. But I think the answer is that they're terrified of new business models. But in fact, those new business models are going to be much more lucrative than the ones they're holding on to. I believe that the more you make video free, and I mean freely available, under non-commercial use, the more valuable it will become, because people will start to use it in ways, point to it, link to it, share it, tell other people about it. And then you go up the stack in value in terms of organizing it, in terms of packaging it, in terms of figuring out ways to deliver it in ways that are convenient and of value and therefore worth paying for. And I just don't get it. I really don't get it. And I'm not sure Google can change their mind. I talked to Bob Wright at NBC Universal about this. I said, well, look at iTunes. It shows people are willing to pay for music. And he said, but they don't pay enough. And you know why they don't pay enough is because he's got a business model and a set of expenses and operating costs and infrastructure that are completely out of sync with the way that we want to consume music, which is a very efficient approach, which is digital distribution and very little marketing, because someone will point me to the music that I might be interested in, which is really how you buy music. You don't buy music because you see an ad on the Super Bowl. You buy music because a friend says this band rocks, right? And so the internet allows for that, which means that the operating expenses of the music business need to do this. But the studios are very involved in those operating expenses and don't want to do that, right? And the Federated Media, my business, is very much about having a very low operating cost and passing the marketing that we bring in to the authors. And I think that the music business will route around this by new music businesses that sprout up, and artists finally sort of weaning themselves from major labels and finding that they can successfully do this on their own. And I think television producers are going to get there as well. Barry Diller and Mark Cuban both disagree with me on this point, and I talked to both of them on stage last week at my Web 2.0 conference. But I think that there will be hits, so to speak, on the web that of talented, accomplished television producers who say, screw this, I'm throwing up a web server, and I'm going direct. And I'm just going to put it up on BitTorrent. I'm going to figure something out. And I just really, really hope for that, but I may be too optimistic. And I think once those things start to happen, I think that the RAA and MPAA will go, oh, gee, maybe we need to figure out how we can play in this new world, because the new world looks like it's passing us by. Right now, the world, much of the world, including the tech world, is not. It's working with them and encouraging their behavior, which I think may not be the best thing to do. One more? Okay.
Before Google came center stage in the media, the darling in the web space was eBay. And you, of course, have made the comparison between Yahoo and Google. What's your take with regard to eBay? Because that's a comparison that's not often made between the implications of Google to eBay, which was to the internet company.
Yeah. The question was about eBay, which was sort of the darling prior to Google. There is a direct relationship between operating margins and stock performance and media darling, right? And eBay had that, right, straight through the bust. They were just ripping it up, and I think that was one reason. And now Google has that. But I've never been a huge student of eBay. Used it, think it's a neat company, but haven't been a student of eBay, and so it's hard for me to say much about the company other than I believe it's an entirely search-driven company, and they revamped their search completely over the last 2 to 3 years in order to be more search compliant, and so you can find things while you're on eBay. I would say that some of the most interesting thinking on the future and implications of eBay with regard to Google is done by Paul Ford in an essay called Amazon 2009, or Google's on 2009. Which is a great, just Google Paul Ford, it'll be the first thing that comes up. Or actually Microsoft Search. Sorry. You guys need just to come up with a word that that we can drop in there. But read that essay because it's great. It really talks about how Google uses its AdWords functionality to create a semi-structured search based on semantic web principles that allows for people to just sell things by basically posting on a blog, so to speak, but posting their things for sale that get indexed, and then it's a wonderful kind of rumination on the future. But I think eBay is still obviously an extraordinary company, but it feels more like it's kind of a mature. I don't know. It's not as much in the conversation in the Valley as it used to be. I mean, it doesn't have that. Pierre Omidyar is doing his own thing now, and he's kind of not really speaking for the company anymore. Meg is very much about speaking to investors, and that's it. She's not really in the Valley in that conversation. So I think that's my phone. Sorry about that. Am I allowed to take one more?
Sure.
Okay. In the back.
One of the other aspects of Google culture that I've been thinking about, because I haven't seen anything about getting published. They bottled up a ton of researchers and not allowed them to publish, and some people could construe this as a good thing, but I think in the long run, academics having good researchers not publishing is not a good thing.
So let me make sure I understand the question. What about the idea of academic publishing at Google and how there doesn't seem to be much coming out of there?
Almost nothing.
Almost nothing, yeah. I actually, in early '03, had a research assistant when I was at the graduate school at Berkeley do a comparison of the number of papers that had come out from various places, and there were, Microsoft far and above had more related in sort of a 2 or 3 orders of degrees to search. And there were very few from Google, and there have been fewer since. That question actually got asked of Sergey last week at the conference, and he said, "This is a problem. You're right. We need to address it." So I think it's an acknowledged issue. At least it is now. And I think at the end of the day, you got to join the conversation if you want the benefits of the conversation. And that is an incredibly important conversation. And perhaps the move with NASA was one of those, you know, again, you can get a little cynical about that. But I think that they understand that they need to be part of the conversation. If you look at the conversation that threw Google up, it was an entirely academic conversation. Entirely, no more than almost any other company. Entirely academic, and a fascinating one. You know, I read all those papers, and you know, I almost understood most of them. Which, and they were, you know, very prescient, and one hopes that conversation continues, because pure research is a rare commodity, and
there's no indication of what he would do.
There's no indication.
From Sergey about what he was going to do about it.
No. It was just someone asked this question of him at the conference, and he said, yeah, you know what? It's an issue. It's a start. Thank you very much for having me. I'm supposed to...